part. That was a really, really great start to the lecture. That was really nailed it all. Now we're doing the boring part that's really shitty. So we have this application, and I'm going to disable JavaScript first of all, because what I recommend when you're doing anything kind of JavaScripty and Ajaxy, what I'd like you to do is get it working without JavaScript first, because making sure that your routes work and all the server stuff is working correctly first is something it's much easier to do when you're in regular Ruby request response mode. You can check that all your routes work, that the validations are firing correctly, and that the database is set up and all that stuff, right? And you kind of get a sense for the behavior. And if you run out of time, at least your website still works. And most of that stuff you need to have anyway in order to do the Ajax stuff. So you're not really wasting time. You're giving yourself a backup plan that if your deadline comes up and you don't have time to do the Ajax part, at least the app's not completely useless, right? And then the benefit of that will be if ever JavaScript isn't working for some reason, then your app will still be functional, which is a super bonus. And okay, so we're going to disable JavaScript, and I click the Ask the 8-ball, and we can see that it refreshes the page and goes to this other route called called answer, and it says don't count on it. And you can ask again, which takes you back to the home page, and you click the button, right? So if you can sort of imagine what that looks like, it's just a regular piece of. Let's get rid of this now. A regular piece of HTML with a form and a post, right? Pretty standard stuff. And on the server side, we're sort of what are we expecting to see on the server side in terms of a route that this is going to hit? What kind of requests? So post, answer, right? And we're expecting it to have a handler for that. So let's go see if there is one. Let's go back to the command line. Okay. So here we go, post answer, and we can see that it just basically does that. It's got a reply, which is 8-ball, which runs this function, which is sort of a sample from an array. It's a very trivial example, right? And then ignore that line 24, 25, 26 for now, and then we have the ERB, where we just render the page. Pretty easy, right? Super easy. And then the views is just the answer page is just that template. Then the index page is just, ignore the script for now, piece of simple HTML. Very simple. And that all works without JavaScript. So now let's say that our customer says, actually, I'd like that to be a bit more interactive. It's kind of annoying that there's a page refresh there. I'd like it to pop up a dialog box instead of going off and doing something else. This is pretty much the simplest Ajax that I could figure out to put together. So the script's at the bottom of the page. Why is it at the bottom of the page? Why is it important that this runs after everything is loaded?
It might describe waiting for an event that's not going to happen until the entire DOM is loaded.
That's close. It's not that it's waiting for the event. I know you know the answer.
In the DOM, you need the DOM first.
Yeah, so you got to remember when you're working with JavaScript, right? The browser, it gets this file and starts reading at the top, and I'll highlight the bits as it reads it, right? So that does that, and the browser goes, oh, I've got an HTML document. Okay, I'm into the head now. That's an optional thing, but there is one here. Now I need to go get this script. I'm going to wait around to go get this script now because that might be important. Thanks for the script, Mr. Server. I'm going to finish the head. Now I've got the DOM elements getting built up now. I have a DOM element, right? And then I'm going to hit the body tag. I'm going to keep going. Hit the form tag. Oh, I've got a form I need to create. I'm going to create a form DOM element. I'm going to set these attributes. So I need to have an input button, close the form. So now I can add the form to the DOM. And then I've got this script tag which I need to execute. Right? So at the time this executes, this stuff is going to refer to things in the document, right? If the script was at the top, like this, right? Now we go through that process again. It's reading the document, it loads the jQuery library, it goes in, it runs this script. What does $button go refer to? Nothing, right? Because that button doesn't exist yet as far as the DOM is concerned. It hasn't been noticed yet, so we don't know anything about it. So that first line 7 will actually select an empty set of elements, right? Because there is no button go yet. We haven't read this part of the file. Right? So that's why we put the scripts at the bottom of the file, so that by the time that we get them, then all the elements have already been loaded. There's another technique which you'll see is document ready, which does the same thing. That allows you to put the script anywhere, but as soon as it gets to the bottom of the DOM element, then jQuery tells those scripts to run. Okay, so that you may notice if you've got like click handlers that are not firing correctly, you want to check that. Go into the debugger. Do you want to see that, or is that clear for everybody? Because I can run this in the debugger in the wrong place. I'll put it at the top just to prove it. So we'll put it above the form, and we'll run the 8-ball example. All right. So now why didn't the debugger fire? Let's see. I was kind of expecting that to break on the debugger. Oh, because I disabled JavaScript to do the demo. And now my windows are really big for some reason. Okay, let's get back to the normal. Here we go. Let's put JavaScript back on. All right, so we're going to refresh the page. Now notice that when you hit the debugger statement, that all the page is gray. That's because there's no DOM yet. There's nothing to render. And if we actually copy this into the command line, into the console, the selector there, bring up the console, paste that, we can see that it's an empty array because there are no elements in the array. So that's not going to do anything. It won't give us an error because jQuery is kind of robust, right? But now as we continue, now you can see the page exists, right? And if I run that same selector again, now the DOM is there, just ready. Okay, so if you're not sure, put the debugger statement into your callbacks and into all the places you're interested in, and the browser will stop as long as the DevTools is open, which it always is, right? Right? So the debugger will always stop unless you have JavaScript disabled, which you probably won't. The browser will stop, and then you can test out your selectors. That's a really common problem. All right, so we've got that working. Now we've got this click handler. Why do we need to prevent the default on the click handler? So I want you on your notepads to write down what would happen if prevent default wasn't there. What do you think, Tracy? Event prevent default. Let's see you peeking. What do you think, Zoe?
If you don't do the prevent default, it'll reroute the page.
Yeah. If you don't do prevent default, what will happen is whatever the browser was going to do anyway is going to happen. And what happens when you click the submit button in a form? Brenda? Boom. It takes you to the route. Okay? So, and what will happen is actually your JavaScript will actually start working, but then the page will form post and all that JavaScript will get thrown away. So okay, you'd be like, why is that working? I was in the debugger, it looked like it was all going, and then nothing ever happens because as soon as that piece of the script finishes executing, the browser goes off and throws the page away and goes off and does the form post. All right? So that's a really common problem too. That happens for links and it happens for forms. So just be careful on those ones. Okay? So the next thing is this is actual Ajax. It's pretty obvious what we're doing here. That little indentation is wrong, so that's why it looked wacky. Always be careful with your indentation. And it's wrong because that doesn't need to be indented. Okay. So we've got this variable called promise. We're assigning that to the result of the post call. Do you know what post is, or have you only seen Ajax? Well, Ajax is like a super function, right? You can do everything with it. If you need to do a get or a post explicitly, you can use these versions of the Ajax function. So you may have seen this as the word Ajax before, right? But we just need to do a post, so we're just going to use the post function so that we don't have to set the post type and all that, get that answer right. All right? So we can just post. It's going to post to the answer route, and the data type is set to JSON. We set the data type to JSON because that's the type that we are expecting to get back from the server. And jQuery is very smart. If you set the data type to JSON, right, what it's going to do, it's going to get the response, and if it's a successful response, the error code is the status code is 200, it's going to try and parse that from JSON into JavaScript objects for you. So everything's ready to go. It's full service. Usually that's what we want. Right? If our route was returning some HTML, we would want to not set the data type to JSON. We would want to set it to HTML. or just leave it blank, right? So we could set this to HTML, but we are expecting, this is the thing people often don't get, this is what you are expecting, right? Now, we get, instead of like, often you'll see this .done just chained onto the end of the Ajax call, but I broke it out and have the variable here called promise. I'm just calling it promise, and I'm setting the done callback so that when it's done, this function will be called with the data that we got from the server. And because I set the data type to JSON, this data will already be converted into a JavaScript object for me. It won't be a string anymore. Does that make sense? All right. Zakai and then Brenda.
What is alert? I don't
Good
see
question.
mine anywhere. Is that a built-in?
Anyone know the answer to that one?
Built-in.
Pop-up window.
It's a built-in pop-up window. It's kind of old school. You don't see it too much, but it's a simple way to interact with the website. You'll see it in a
Yeah,
second.
I remember that.
If three of you guys went to the Ajax talk, and they did a traditional like Ajax call, would you be able to do a traditional Ajax call out into the bars that you have there?
You mean traditional Ajax is in hand-coded JavaScript, or like Ajax as in?
Set the post and then the data type and all
So I
that.
put the URL in there.
Yeah, so we can do
Yeah.
Ajax. It's going to be like this. This comes in as an argument.
There's like a URL, a data type, and then the data, but I noticed that your data is in another, it looks like Ajax.
No, it's the same. I'll show it to you. The route is answer, and then I think it's type. I always get that one wrong. That's why I don't like to do it by hand. We'll try. We'll see what it works. See if it works.
It's either type or method.
Yeah, it could be method. That sounds pretty likely.
I have type.
You have type? Okay, so we'll see. Maybe this will work. So do you see how basically what it was doing? Ajax is the global function that does all this stuff, but it's 3 lines less code and less error prone if you use the built-in methods which are provided for you. But we'll give this a try. I'm happy to try it. And so let's get the server started again. The server's already running. We've got JavaScript enabled. So we'll refresh the page just for good measure. We can see that our script now is at the bottom of the page. I'll click the button, and we get the Ajax response. Ajax says yes. Now, we don't quite know, this is what the alert box looks like, by the way. You can click OK. But if we look on the network tab, we'll see that there's a little bit more that happened. I have this, so here's the original page request, and we can preview the response, and you can see that there's all the HTML. And then we loaded the jQuery library, which we saw in the head method, in the head block. And then we look at the answer, and you can see this is the response that came back from the server. So we got a status code 200. The response headers are set, and kind of expecting to see a content type header in there, but didn't see it. Maybe I didn't set it. But for however it was sent, jQuery was able to convert what came back from the server into those objects. If we look at the code that calls the block, you can see I'm just using data as a JavaScript object and spilling it out. One nice thing to do in here is just use something like console log data. That can be very helpful just to see, what you got back in its entirety. So let's give that a try and refresh it. We'll see. Right, and we can see that we got back an object with the answer Ajax says most likely. Okay, so the question is, how did all that happen on the server? Brandon, did you have a different question?
Yeah, only because the Ajax call we originally sent from referencing yesterday, I know didn't make it to that thing yesterday, but we were sending data as well, and I noticed that you got it in your response without sending.
Yeah, you don't have to send data. That's if you need it. That's like a more advanced thing. I'm giving you the simplest possible form.
Okay.
Sometimes you want to send data. Sometimes it's enough just to call the route. So you don't need to send data. Okay? And this particular one doesn't need anything. So we look at the source code, and we can see that we're getting data back. Now let's go look at the route implementation. And here we can see at the bottom. So we're doing @reply 8-ball, which we understand, right? Just gives us a random string that we're going to use. And then there's this line on line 24 where we're saying if request.xhr, which is a conditional flag in rack, I think, actually, which allows the application to distinguish between requests which are regular page requests, like links and form posts, from requests which originate from JSON and from JavaScript as Ajax requests. So there's a header that's set so that the server can differentiate between those things. And so that gives you the option when you're converting something from a regular form post to an Ajax form post to use the same route, but then just have a little if statement in there that's the thing that's going to be different. And usually the thing that's going to be different is that if you form post to somewhere, you're going to, and it's a regular HTTP request from the browser, you're going to redirect or display more HTML, right? But when it's an Ajax request, it's expecting something else usually, and that would be in the form of JSON, okay? So that's a totally different response, but the logic that precedes that is the same. Whether you're updating something or deleting something or whatever it is, you're changing something or creating something, that logic is all the same. The little piece that's different is at the end whether or not you display more HTML or redirect, or for JSON, for Ajax requests, you actually return some JSON object. Okay? So you'll often see this if request.htr, and then in that context that we're going to use the JSON method to render JSON back to the client as a string instead of sending the form back. Does that make sense? Sometimes this looks really nice and sometimes this gets really hokey. It depends on how close the behavior is between the route for the form without the Ajax request and then the one you want for the Ajax request. But so if it gets too crazy, you can break them out into separate routes, and I'll have an example of that in the next example. Does that make sense? Okay, so this code is available to you. We've seen it working, and we changed it to have the full Ajax notation. But again, I'm going to put that back to post because I think it's a little cleaner and less error prone. There we go, still working. And notice, like, if JavaScript gets disabled for whatever reason, the click does the full form post and the application still is functional. This is a nice fallback. You want to aim for this. Okay. All right. So let's wrap that up. And the next thing I want to go to is the calculator application. Okay. Let's go see if we can find this one. Any other questions on that? Okay, so let's git clone. Again, the same kind of setup. Let's just get the editor up. We've got a simple server route, and this is the basics of the app. It's a bit hokey, but I hope it illustrates the point. And it does send some data, and it does receive some data. And I've added some extra bells and whistles, so you have kind of a full appreciation of how it should work. So on the home page, there's a form, which is in there, which is like a calculator form, which is just a regular HTML form. We can see that it normally posts to the calc route. And if we look in here, we have a post to the calc route, which is going to get the parameters from the form and then do some kind of math and maybe have some errors or not. Okay? So that's basically what the route is. So let's give that a try. And we go bundle, install. Oh, I guess we'll try and run it. Let's see if it works. There's no bundle. No, I should have a gem file in this, but I don't. So let's see if it works. Okay, we got lucky. Go to 4, 5, 6, 7 again. Okay, so here's the form. I'm going to disable JavaScript again, make sure that's disabled. Okay, that's still disabled, that's nice. And then I'm going to click the 3 plus 5. What's it going to do? It's going to give us 3 plus 5 is equal to 8. Right? So it's the same kind of thing, a full page form post, go back to the calculator. But I think it would be a lot nicer if this calculator did the math on the page without the refresh. Right? So let's enable JavaScript. Okay, and then I don't think we need to refresh, but I'm going to do it anyway. So let's do 5 times 4. And now we can have a more interactive experience, right? So that's kind of what we're going for. And also we can do little stuff like this, like if the form fields are missing, then we can say do some kind of invalid input. So this is sort of that minimum kind of interaction that we're going to try and get together with full-on Ajax. Doing the validation is like a bonus phase. Like it's a little tricky to figure that out, a little bit more code, so don't aim for the validation first. Again, the first thing you want to do is get the route working without Ajax, and then add your Ajax stuff to the route. So let's see how we achieve that end result. So on the form page, I added a script. Again, this is at the bottom and it's using document ready, so that's a little bit of an overkill. It's a habit. I find it hard to trust that I can put them at the end of the file and everything's going to be fine, but I'm getting there. And we can see we have a calc form on submit handler, which is this big block of code. And I put it all in one block just to kind of have it all there and to keep the example relatively simple. Okay, so this first piece up here we'll come back to, but this is about validation. So we'll skip that for now and then go on with the rest of the stuff. So let's assume the validation passes. And now in this case, I'm using the full version of Ajax because Brendan wanted us to. And so here we have type is equal to post, and in this case I've got a different URL. I don't have to use the same URL as on the form. So what I've done here is I've broken out my JavaScript, my JSON stuff into a different set of routes, and I've called them API v1 calc. So that's just a choice I made so that we could have two separate sets of code so we can compare. That if we do it this way, we don't need to use the isRequestXHR because the routes are specifically designed to be used by Ajax requests. And again, it's very simple to add form data. In fact, with jQuery, they make it super easy with this form serialize method, which kind of magically gets all the values from the form and jams them into some secret format that we don't quite understand, and pushes them up to the server. So by the time they appear in our route, the params are ready to be used. It's magical. It's very nice. And you can actually look at the format if you're interested about what it does. It's kind of fun. And what is this data type on line 52? What is this saying again? What we're expecting to receive. So our route that we implement on the server should be at this location. It's a post route, and it should generate JSON. It's expecting to get the form parameters serialized. So in this case, there's an input X, an operator, which is this select box, and then a text Y. So there's 3 parameters, and all of them get serialized up. So that's really handy. Again, we'll do this this done. What happens under what conditions is done called? Do you remember from what I said before? What 2 things have to happen for done to get called? Okay, so that's right. Yeah, the 200 has to happen. So generally everything has to be okay. What's the second thing that has to happen in this particular context because of line 52 that has to happen, otherwise the done won't get called? Yes, Lisa. It has to be JSON. If the server generated something else and it wasn't JSON, that parsing step would fail and my done callback wouldn't get called. So it's very common to have that mistake. All right? So let's assume. Yes, Brenda?
It has to be defined as JSON. It has to be JSON because that's the data type that you set.
Yeah, I set the data type to JSON, which tells jQuery to say, hey, I'm expecting JSON back, so please try and parse it for me because I can't be bothered to find the JSON parser. Right? You can't do it yourself. All right, so let's say that works. Everything's do the happy case. So then we get the results. We locate this div or whatever element that happens to be called calc result, and we set the text to be some description of the operation that happened. Notice that we're getting these values from the data object that came back. There's no need to pull them out of the form. And in fact, the values in the form might be different because they could have submitted a different math problem by now. All right? So we want to respond back from the server with enough information to display the result. And then I'm using some crazy effect that seemed like a good idea in 1985. Right? To slide down the div in a 600 milliseconds timeout. Okay, so that's generally what we saw when everything went well. Boop, boop. And if we look at the server, we can see that every time we run calc, or every time we run do, there's another Ajax request. You see how this is type XHR? So generally, if you only want to see the XHR request, you can click on the filter and it will just show them for you, which is kind of nice once you're doing your Ajax because you might have a bunch of scripts and CSS files and stuff like that going on, and they're getting a bit in the way. Whereas this one will just run every time, and then we can click and look at the response, preview the response, and see we get an object which has an operator times the result 24, and the x and the y values are in there nicely for us. Benjamin.
What does XHR stand for again? Is that?
It stands for XML HTTP request. And it used to be that was what we thought we were going to do with all this stuff, and then JSON became the fact. So today it would be called JXR or something like that, right? So that's where the X comes from. So that's basically what we're doing. Now in the failure case, I don't know what that might look like. Well, if we don't get to submit the answer. So what kind of failure case could we come up with? Let's say 4 divided by 0, right? Result was infinity. So we got notice how the status code is different. And this is very common in Ajax. When something doesn't quite work, we use the status code to great effect. So this allows us to tell the client pretty easily that math operation you just tried to do didn't work for some reason, right? And rather than having a bunch of if statements, that causes, there's another if statement in there, but anyway, the fail callback to get called, right? So the done callback, this function got called when everything was happy. In this case, we didn't get a 200, we got a 400. So fail got called. And in this case, I'm still getting a JSON response, and I'm pulling out the error so I can display it to the user. So in the case that your validations fail or something happens on the server, you want to be able to communicate that back through your API, right? So you need to leave space in your JSON response for some kind of way, error message or something like that. Okay? So we're able to pull that out and use that to do the display. So again, here we're just pulling out. In this case, it looks a bit. This is definitely not as friendly, right, as the done case, because the variables are a bit more complicated. But the object, you get back this object, which is the actual promise itself, I think, and then it has the response JSON, and then dot error. So this becomes the object that we would have gotten here in the data. It's not just passed in as an object. You get the actual response itself, and then you pull out this thing using response.json, and now this piece is just accessing that JSON object. So let's put a little, because that's a bit confusing, let's console log the response that we get back, and then refresh the page. 4 divided by 0. And now we can see that we got back an object where the result was infinity with the error key. That's how I like to be consistent if I can and just call it error. So be consistent across your whole app. There's no real definition for how you're supposed to handle that. But this is a reasonable way to do it. And you can see if there's an error, then I'm just going to use that. Now this other one here it's possible that there's some other error that happens, and I just wanted to display that for demo purposes. But this is the sort of the case where it failed and it wasn't catastrophic. There was some kind of error validation or something like that. We're going to display it like this. And then we use that same slide down technique here. All right? So that's how we would use, how we would post a form to a server. We would serialize the arguments in the data attribute of the Ajax request, and then we would handle both the done and the fail. In the case where we get the fail case, our route, in this case, here's the route. In the case where we have an error on the server, I set the response code to 400 with this halt operation, and then pass in the JSON object as the response. So you can sort of copy paste this if you want. It's pretty boilerplate. There's some discussion on what the actual error code should be, but there's no real standard. 409, 400, 422, there's a lot of different opinions on that. But as long as it's in the 400s, and probably one of those three, it's okay. I would just use 400 unless you need some specific case, right? Saying something went wrong, sorry, I couldn't really handle that situation, all right? And that's what caused the fail to happen, which is what we wanted, right? Because there's fundamentally different paths on the client, right? If everything went well, you're going to do one thing. If it didn't, you're going to display an error message. Okay? That's basically it. Any question on that, Cameron? Yeah, that's a good question. So let's take a peek at it. So the question was, how is that form.serialize working? So this looks like a bit magical.
Like decrypt sort of.
No, it's nothing that crazy. It's just converting it into a string, right? Remember, everything has to be a string, okay? So somehow we have to get all that form data and make it into a string. And there's various conventions on how to do that in HTTP. And I can show you what it does. If we console log, and this is a jQuery function, the serialize. So we'll just console log that out, and you'll be able to see what it generates. It's just not something you'd want to do by hand. So 3 plus 3, you can see there. You see how that's 3, no, I'll make it a little bigger. You see how it's doing x equals 3, ampersand operator equals plus, ampersand y equals 3? It looks pretty easy to do, right? You could totally do that on your own, but there are some edge cases where it gets kind of crazy. So instead of doing that ourselves, we just allow jQuery to take care of that for us. And then if we look at the post in the request that we sent up to the server, in the headers, we'll see request header, and then form data. You see how the form data, and then, yeah, view source. There's the form data that was sent up. So the browser knows how to package that information up in such a way that it gets to the server, and Rack knows how to interpret that so that by the time you get it, they look regular. They're like regular params again, as long as you use these standard tools. So I really don't think you should be doing any custom processing. Just use form serialize and use params on the server. That's it. Okay? Any other questions on that? Lisa? Okay.
If we're going to have two different routes, so one's going to be, one handles it as a JavaScript or jQuery,
Yeah.
and the other one is if it fails.
Right.
How do I put that in the one form submit button?
Well, without JavaScript, remember, so what happens is, without JavaScript, so the question is, if you have two routes, how does the form handle both of them, right? And so if we look, when no JavaScript is happening, this is the form. It just posts to the cow corral, right? So that's that side of it done. Now the question is, how does JavaScript post to a different route? Well, if we look in here, we just explicitly say URL API v1 calc, right? If you wanted it to go to the same place, you could just pull that out of the form object as an attribute and be good to go. Yes?
What's that if okay 949?
Okay, let's look at that. That's a kind of a bonus thing that I put in to show you that you want to consider these kinds of things. For example, if the form is completely empty, it makes no sense to allow the submit button to go, right? Because what's the point? The user's just going to wait and then see an error message. So we want to do a little bit of what we call client-side validation. Now, this doesn't mean you don't have to do it on the server. You always have to do a server-side validation, regardless of what you do on the client. Okay, so just remember that. But if you want to make it a little bit more nice, you can do some validation on the client side. And what this side does is it finds, well, actually, what I want you to do is just read that pseudocode and see if you can, on your whiteboards, try and understand what it's doing. Like, just read that and try and be the code interpreter and see what's going to happen when that executes. Under what conditions would different things happen, and what would happen? You know, and some things that might be new to you are that this selector is using an attribute type selector, but that really works the same as a regular selector. It's just some extra filtering. Another thing that might be new to you is this $.each, but you can probably figure out what that's doing, bearing in mind that this is a collection, right? So there's some little bit of understanding about how jQuery each might be implemented. And then there's sort of a line here that looks like it's not doing that much, but it's doing something. What is it doing? And this is kind of like into JavaScript land now. We've got isNan parse float. And what isNan is a function which returns true if the thing that you give it is specifically not a number. Right? And nan in JavaScript is an identifier that says this is something went wrong with math and I ended up with this not a number. It's not a string or something like that. That wouldn't be that is not a nan. Right? Not a number is a thing. It's a single thing that is the result of trying to do something with numbers that didn't work out, right? So you're trying to parse some value somehow, and if it's not a number, so what do we sort of end up with here? What do you think, Tariq? What is this block doing?
It's checking the input. Adding a missing class, which says something or not sure what okay true or false does.
Okay.
Moves that class in.
So it doesn't remove it. So under some condition it adds the class, and under some condition it removes the class, right? So this is kind of toggling the class. If that statement on line 35 is true, the field will have a new class called missing, which is a CSS class. And if that statement is false, then it will not have the missing class. So where would you look for more information on what that might do? We go into the CSS file, right, and take a peek in there. And that would probably be in the public CSS directory because you've already done a bunch of stuff. Or probably, knowing me, it's in the layout because I probably forgot to add it as a CSS file. Bad style. Because it wasn't obvious where I should look for it. So just remember to follow the things, right? So now we can sort of scroll down, and then we have dot missing, where it gives us a border color red, and this is probably some kind of red color. Some versions of Sublime will actually make that into a color, right? So what we can see is, like, if that validation fails, OK will be set to false, and any of the fields that had an error associated with their which turned out to be not a number, which is what we were expecting, what we needed, right, will be red, which is kind of it's a reasonable user experience. It's not particularly pretty. I'm not super great at CSS. So the idea is, if JavaScript is enabled, right, then those fields become, and we can inspect the elements to see that they have the class missing. And the one that, if I put a 3 in there and click go, the one that does have the thing doesn't have the class missing, right? So this is one way you can kind of toggle states pretty easily. And that the OK flag, all I'm doing is saying, if my very rough client-side validation fails, then I just don't want to submit it. So I'll just sort of say to the user, hey, you've got some kind of error, please fix it. And then eventually, and you could do that validation on every key up, right? You could I chose to do it on the button, but basically on every time you do key up, you could run that whole validator. It wouldn't be such a big deal. And then you could have it be interactive. Like those things where they do the password strength things, and it's like red, and then it goes yellow, and you get super long, it goes green. That's done like that, right? It's like every time the key goes up, run the validator and then set the style depending on what the validator figured out is if it's good or not. Does that make sense? Okay, cool.
What's that iterator?
Oh, the iterator, that's a good one, right? So JavaScript didn't, or at least in the versions that I'm familiar with, doesn't have a nice way to iterate over a collection. And what this does is the each method, what it does is it calls this function for each of these items. So it works a lot like Ruby each, except that on Ruby each, the collection would be on the left side. And in fact, I probably could put this on the left-hand side. So let's try that, because it was from jQuery. That might work, but I'm not sure. Let's see. Boom, boom. Yeah, it still works.
So the iterator, you just need it there. You're not using it, but it's the second argument. Is the
Yeah, like if that was just an array, like a regular JavaScript array, I would probably need to pass it in as the inputs, like on this side. But because I actually got that collection from a jQuery function, it probably it knows that it can do in each already. At least that's my understanding of the situation. But just you might see it. Seem like a good thing to throw in.
Can you explain the field versus equals field?
This one. Okay, so a lot of things that you get back are in the browser. Like if you say get document get element by ID and then what was it? X or something maybe. Let's go figure out what that element is. Oh, it's not a. It doesn't have a thing. So let's get query selector, document query. Query selector. Let's just pick a dot row. Get that div. Right, there's the div. Okay, that element is not a jQuery object, right? So you can't do things like closest on it. Oh, you can't. Sometimes you can't do these things. What is it? It's not a real. You know how Chrome has like a miniature version of jQuery built in. So a lot of this stuff is going to work now, but it used to be what the difference between it is that one of them is a node object from the DOM, a raw JavaScript node, which has some functionality, and the other one, once you wrap it in the $sign function, it gives you a jQuery object which has all the jQuery functionality. And it used to be a bigger difference between the two, right? So the main difference would be in browser compatibility, like one browser being different from another with the different node implementations. But when you wrap it, then you know you have a jQuery object, and you can call all the regular jQuery functions on it. So I got into the habit of doing that, and I also got into the habit of prefixing any of those special jQuery objects with a $sign, so that I know that I can call those variables, those functions on them. Okay. All right. So that's that. How are we doing for time? So do you want to try? Should we try and do that? Have you had enough? That was pretty long, I think. I mean, what I can do is I'll while you're working on your next lecture, I'll go through and add that to Tinder Pizza, and then you can kind of see how that would look in the. Is that the best way to do that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
I do.
Yeah.
So back on the other, I guess, page where you have $sign, using it as jQuery object, when you did jQuery.h,
Yeah.
I guess it's representative of jQuery object.
Yeah. This.
And then you made it interchangeable earlier with input.
Yeah.
Does that, I mean,
So there are two different methods actually. There's this one which is the jQuery object. jQuery is funny because you use it in so many different ways. You can use it as a function, you can use it as an object, and it's just very confusing. So don't get too hung up on how that's done. Right? It's unusual that you're going to have an object that you can call as a function and also has properties that you use as functions all the time. So it wouldn't be that common. But what I'm saying is this object that I got on line 31 also happens to implement a function called each, which basically does the same thing over itself, right? So I can call jQuery's global.each function on with and passing the collection as a parameter, or I can call the collections.each function, which obviously iterates over itself. Not too much of it's not a big stressor. The main goal today, so the main focus for you today was to realize that this is how you make an Ajax call, right? You can serialize the form data using form serialize. You can pick any URL you want. You can specify the data type. Usually you would specify JSON unless you were expecting HTML back. Okay. Done will only be called under what conditions? Returns a JSON and a 200, right? Anything else will cause the fail to fire. And then the handling of the fail is a little bit more complicated because you don't quite get as much help. All right? Cool. Go forth and Ajaxify.
Really quick question.
Okay.
So, as far as the passion projects are concerned, if we're implementing some of the competencies for this week's material, we're going to be using this for all of our routes.
I wouldn't say all of them. I mean, the way that I expect you to be able to do this, but it doesn't. It also doesn't make sense to like just make Ajaxify everything. It's just pointless. So what I like to see the whole application working with rock solid CRUD, with validations and all that stuff nailed down, and really with the right routes and everything, right? Like RESTful routing and validations, definitely. Get all of that work, get your authentication working, and then look at your application and say, okay, that really annoying thing where I have to go through 3 pages to do that one thing, I could do that on one page. You know, maybe I can have a delete function. If I have a list of things, I could have a button that's a delete button that when I click the button, does it in Ajax, hides the little item from the list, makes the Ajax call, and then is done. You know, these kinds of small things that would really improve the usability of the app, I think are valid uses for this kind of Ajax. And you don't want to get too crazy, because if you get more complicated, there's frameworks that we would use to help us do more complicated things. So it's really just for like individual stuff like that. Okay? Awesome. Thank you very much.